Hi, I'm Ricky Giwa. Welcome to Simply Science One-on-One, our interview series where we go over some of the amazing research done here at Natural Resources Canada. Today, we're joined by Sarah Karam, a project engineer who specializes in flood mapping in northern and western Canada. Welcome, Sarah.
Thanks for having me.
So can you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in flood mapping?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm a projects engineer with Natural Resources Canada, working for the Flood Hazard Identification and Mapping Program, so FIMP for short. So I've always kind of been interested in water resources. Since my bachelor's degree in civil engineering at the University of Ottawa, I had this hydrology course that just really interested me, and I just became passionate about it. And I just kept studying and then just got my master's degree and got a PhD. And yeah, here I am doing flood hazard mapping for NRCan.
As a project engineer, what does your day-to-day look like? Can you tell us a little bit about your daily schedule?
Yeah, so I mean, every day is kind of different. Sometimes we have really, really busy days, sometimes less busy days with meetings, and you know how it is. But a lot of the days we tend to collaborate with our provinces and territories, the engineers that work specifically in the provinces and territories that help us do the flood hazard mapping. So I specifically work on the western side of Canada, and a little bit the northern side as well. So you have like BC, Alberta, Manitoba, Northwest Territories, Yukon. So I have a lot of these kind of check-in meetings with the engineers, and we also have meetings with consulting engineers that we work with in order to model and produce these maps. It's a lot of quality control, a lot of making sure that the outputs from the projects are reasonable, easy to understand for the public, easily accessible to the public, lots of reviewing of the documentation that they give us as well. So yeah, every day is different, but every day we're learning new things too. You know, we do a lot of research in the FIMP, which is like part of our Advancing FIMP initiative, which is great. Lots of, you know, climate change incorporations and yeah, and using AI, which, you know, technology is just evolving so crazy rapidly that it's becoming so important to use it on a daily basis, really. So yeah.
That's very true. Yeah, I just wanted to go over some of like the common causes of floods. Like when you are doing these maps, how do you identify like areas that are more at risk compared to other areas?
There are different types of mechanisms that, you know, can cause a flood. And what we see mostly in Canada, there's like 4 types. So we have coastal flooding. So that's mostly for, you know, provinces like British Columbia who are on the coast, right? These types of floods can be caused by like storm surges. So like crazy rainfall events that happen just make, you know, the low-lying coastal areas are just completely flooded. We also have, you know, earthquakes, natural disasters, tsunamis, like all those things need to be considered when dealing with a coastal area because, you know, the damages can just be really, really devastating. And we also have pluvial and fluvial modeling. So that's basically just the flood occurs when there's like heavy rainfall or heavy snow melt and urban drainage areas kind of get overwhelmed by all that rainfall coming in. And then the elevation inside of the river just kind of keeps going up, 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 and it exhausts the riverbed, and you know that causes the flooding. We also have a very important type of flooding, which is ice jam flooding. So that happens a lot in our northern territories. So basically what it is you can think of it as like a beaver dam, right? So it gets really, really cold and it produces a lot of ice. And then the ice starts to break up and causes like really big blocks. So you have like a bunch of ice blocks on the river in one section of the river, and the water can't flow properly through the river. So it kind of just keeps building up and building up and building up upstream of the river and causes all that flooding. So coastal, pluvial, fluvial, ice jam. Oh, and there's also one that's kind of rare, but it happens, so it has to be taken into consideration, is infrastructure, problems with infrastructure. So if you have like a dam break, for example, that could be completely devastating. So it's important to you know, do maintenance and make sure that these infrastructures are considered when doing flood risk assessment.
So when you and your team are producing these maps, like what are they used for specifically? Like you've mentioned the infrastructure, you've mentioned how they are used in like coastal areas. Are they separate from each other? How do they apply to different areas?
So flood maps can be used by anybody. in the community. Anybody who has a house or a cabin, for example, and they're worried, we live kind of close to the river and we're worried about flooding, you could easily access these maps and see what kind of risk your infrastructure is at. So these maps are kind of just like, when you go on Google Maps and you look at like the buildings and the street maps and all that stuff. So it's kind of like that, and it shows you the river system and it shows you the flood, right? And then it also shows you like a flood extent. So basically the flood extent is just, it shows you which areas of the map are going to be covered by water due to the flood. These flood hazard maps are really useful for, infrastructure, land use planning. So for example, you're developing something in a certain area and then you say, well, is it going to flood? And then they look at the maps and they say, well, yeah, it is going to flood. And so, maybe think about putting it somewhere else. And for emergency planning, that's super, super important. Sometimes these communities already exist in a high-risk flooding area. So yeah, it just helps plan for emergencies.
So you mentioned a little bit about like emergency responses. Are there any NRCan emergency response mappings for risk zones? Like how are they used in situations of emergency?
Yeah, so we, in our team for FIMP, we don't specifically design these emergency response maps. We produce more just the flood hazard maps. So it shows you like the risk of several communities to be impacted by certain types of flooding. We do the modeling that comes with it. We help with, being able to produce these maps that later help to define and design these emergency planning maps. So it wouldn't be our team specifically who handle these kinds of things, but it is, within the NRCan sector. And, NRCan is a very big department. It deals with a lot of different things, and we kind of interact between departments to try to help each other develop these kinds of systems.
Yeah, it sounds cool. And can you share any example of how flood maps have made a difference, whether in communities or in just like local areas or for homeowners? Like when have they been helpful?
Yeah, of course. So I can think of so many examples. I mean, flood hazard mapping throughout all provinces and territories have been helpful for everybody, like I mentioned before, in land use planning and emergency response. I guess one specific example that, off the top of my head, that I could think of is the Ontario Conservation Authority. So they use our flood hazard maps during flooding seasons in order to plan for emergency response. So literally the firefighters will look at our flood hazard maps and say, okay, well, this area is going to be higher risk. Look at the water elevation in this area. We're going to have to kind of put more of our attention over there. That would be, for example, one thing that I could think of, but these kinds of instances happen everywhere around Canada.
Yeah, and it's super useful for like communities who are in those risk zones.
Exactly.
Yeah. And how are these maps created? Like, can you walk us through the process of the creations?
So there are several steps that are involved in, actually creating these flood hazard maps. The first would be, well, we look for which area needs it the most, right? We try to prioritize our areas and our resources. Once we find a high-risk area that, maybe doesn't already have flood hazard maps for it, so we would consider that to be one of our options. So we would write a scope of work. So what needs to be done for the projects, what are the outcomes of the projects, what we expect in terms of timing and budget and all these things. Then once the scope of work is determined, we put out a request for proposals, or an RFP. So we write all this information on the request, and then we have all these companies that they're engineering consulting companies, and they come in and they say, well, we can do exactly what you're asking for. Here's our proposal. So they give you a list of items of things that they're going to send you, like deliverables, at what time they're going to send them to you, the meetings that we're going to have. They make sure to explain to us in the proposal that they understand what we expect from them. It also gives us a chance to kind of evaluate different companies, and so we come together for a consensus with, and not forgetting that this is all happening with NRCan in collaboration with the provinces and territories as well. So it's not just us making the decision, it's really a collaboration between us and the provinces and territories. And then so we come to a consensus to decide which company, we feel based on their expertise as well, if they've worked on previous projects and, we know the kind of work that they do, and budget considerations. And then we say, okay, we all agree that one of these projects, one of these companies is going to do the good work, and then we choose them. So once that's done, we can actually start. So it usually starts with like a kickoff meeting. So we have a meeting with us and the engineers and the provinces and territories as well. And then we kind of just introduce everybody. We talk about the scope of work. We talk about, what's going to happen, what we're going to do, what we expect from them, and also sometimes what they expect from us, right? A lot of our job too is to help them by providing information, data, missing information that they would need to actually develop their models and all that stuff. That's what the kickoff meeting is good for. And then one of the first steps also is to have an engagement meeting with the community. So this is also very, very, very important because we try to get as much information from the community that we can, because these people, they are living inside of this high-risk area. They 9 times out of 10 know what it's like to have their house flooded, or to be impacted by a flood in some way, or maybe even a family member or a friend. So we try to get as much information from them to see what they expect from us in this project as well. And we also ask them to provide, for example, some people are able to provide high water marks. So basically what that is if there's a flood, and then after a while kind of goes away, you can kind of see like lines on, for example, if you have like a porch, right? And you can kind of see where the water came all the way up to. So they would take a picture, we would go on the field doing surveys and measuring that, and it gives us actual raw data that we can use to actually calibrate our model. So these are things and steps that are very, very important in terms of, actually producing the flood hazard map. Once we complete the community engagement, we get all the necessary data that we need. Then we go into actually producing the models. So this is when the engineers take out their computers and do the modeling work, do the statistical analysis, do all that good stuff. And then eventually they produce a map. And then we look at the map and we analyze it, we give our comments, we make sure that it's easily understandable. Like somebody who doesn't have a background in water resources or anything like that we want them to be able to look at the map and understand everything about it, what went into it. And there are also reports attached to the map. So if anyone has any questions about how it was developed, they could easily, get access to that. So yeah, that's pretty much how it is.
It's so interesting to see that there's so much work going into this, like so much engagement and community involvement and everything. So I think that's really good.
Yeah.
And I was also wondering, how do you decide how do you prioritize what areas are more in need of those maps compared to other areas? Like, how do you know which ones are like at more risks and need a map like immediately compared to others?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say some communities need it more than others. I would say all communities should have flood hazard maps. It's very important, and we do whatever we can. I mean, eventually the objective is to have all of Canada flood mapped, right? For us at the moment, the way we decide which project should happen, where and at what specific time, it depends on, for example, population density would be something that we would consider. We also would consider if there is already a flood hazard map there, because sometimes there is a flood hazard map for a certain community, but it's outdated, so not really reliable, or low resolution. So we would have to come in and redo that work and make sure that it's a reliable map. So not necessarily areas that don't have any mapping done.
So can anyone access these maps, and how do they find them?
Yeah, so anybody from the public can access these maps. They're open source. Most provinces and territories do have like a portal where you can access the maps and interact with them. It's really like useful, and anybody can access it. And you also, if you're looking for the specific websites, our NRCan website has a list of the provinces and territories website where you can access these portals, and that will be in the link in the description of this interview.
Thank you. And are there any other resources you think are important to share, people should know?
So we do have the Federal Flood Mapping Guidelines series, and this is super useful. Like, you just go online, type it up, and you'll see it. It tells you like all of the criteria that need to be met when developing a flood hazard map, everything that goes into it in terms of hydrologic modeling, hydraulic modeling, climate change considerations. Like, it gives you all this information. So if you're ever looking at a flood hazard map and you're wondering, you know, what does it take to make something like this? You can just easily go on the guideline series and it will guide you completely through it. Another thing would be the Flood Data Hub. That gives you access to raw data like rainfall data, flow data of the rivers, I already said that, temperature, yeah, all this information that could be useful. Historical floods also.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I feel like I have a better appreciation for flood maps and how they're created and the process that goes into it. That's it for today. Thank you for joining us on our first edition of Simply Science One-on-One. Remember to follow us on all of our social media platforms, and bye for now.